Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of the Inspired Writer Collective. You guys are listening from all around the globe. We've got listeners on every continent except Antarctica. So, anyone doing some travel, please download an episode if you happen to be there. But thank you so much to our listeners. Thank you for your subscribing to the channel and to the podcast. Thank you for your likes. Thank you so much for your reviews. The reviews are really important. So if you haven't done that yet, leave us a 5-star review. Let us know what you like about the podcast. This week, we're bringing you another book review. Those have been some of our more popular podcast episodes. And for this month, we did The Alchemist. So some of you may have had this as required reading in high school or college. I personally never had it assigned. So this was my first venture into this book, but I went into it knowing that it was one that is on the list of, here's a classic everyone needs to read. Here's something all artists need to read. It would be listed on those sorts of lists. And so Stephanie and I did that this month, and we're so glad that we did. We both got a lot out of reading this. There's so much here for anyone in the creative arts, particularly with writing, but any journey. So we really encourage our fellow writers here to pick it up. It's a short read. It's not complex, but there are so many nuggets of wisdom packed into such a condensed book. Now, this book has been out for ages, so you can easily find this at the, secondhand store, maybe even those like little library, books on your neighbor's street corner. Like, you can get your hands on a copy of this book. So we're going to do our best to unpack a lot of the big lessons and takeaways. But mainly, we're going to be relating the story to the writing journey. So it'll be less of an analysis of writing style or storytelling or character development, and more about the actual message and applying it to our writing journeys. So Stephanie, why don't you kick us off? What was your experience like reading this book?
Well, very similar to what you just shared, and it too was my first reading of the book, which was kind of surprising to me just because I've read so many classics over time and been given so many books, and I thought to myself, why hasn't this book landed in my hands? But then maybe now was the time that it was meant to land there because of making this shift into the writing journey, and it's new, and it's essentially like what as the book talks about, my personal legend, the path that I'm meant to be on. Because in October of last year, I was in Nepal and I had a meeting with an astrology guru who read my birth chart and all the signs. And before the meeting, he didn't have anything about me other than the chart. He didn't know anything. There was no interview or questionnaire. And it was immediately from the beginning, it was all about how writing was the journey I'm meant to be on. And I'd been thinking about it for a while, but wasn't fully confident in it. And then in reading The Alchemist, it just became more clear, this idea that we know what we're meant to be doing, but then things come up along the way that maybe stop us in our paths, or we think we're meant to be doing something. And it sounds woo-woo, and there might be people out there who think like, oh, that just is too out there, like the universe is not conspiring to help me. But I mean, that particular idea is repeated multiple times in the book, that when you have this desire for something, the universe does make the paths for you.
Yeah, and we'll provide some examples, from our own writer's journeys as we go through these various kind of benchmarks. Now, we've talked a little bit on this podcast before on previous episodes about the hero's journey. And so The Alchemist is a classic example of the hero's journey. So, the ordinary world, the ordeal, stepping into a new world, the trials, the dark night of the soul, and then ultimately returning with the elixir and all of that. So you may see some of those themes, but we'll give some examples too of how we've seen these different like kind of moments or beats show up within our own writing. And so, yeah, I think that's great when we're talking about that personal legend, Stephanie. I don't know. I was asked on a podcast interview the other day, it's like, oh, how did you know you wanted to be a writer? And to be honest, that was not like how I came to it. Like it was literally presented to me as a option by my sister of, hey, do you want to write a nonfiction book with me with this like monthly challenge? And I said, sure. It wasn't like, idea, I'm going to be a writer. How do I be a writer? I put words on a page. Like it was just interesting the way that unfolded for me in my journey, where it wasn't something I just came to as an idea, but just an opportunity was presented, and I followed my intuition about that being an interesting thing. And oh my gosh, it has led us on quite a journey. I mean, we've talked before, even that initial conversation I had with Stephanie one time when we were just having a, catch up chat via Zoom. And I asked her, hey, do you want to start a business together? And then even then, the podcast was not a part of that business plan. That came a couple of weeks later after we started the business. And Stephanie was like, hey, I think we should do a podcast. So it's really interesting the way that different people's, personal legends or journeys, whatever you want to call it, soul's purpose can unfold. And there are a lot of challenges along the way. But I love this line in the intro. Now, mine was the 10th edition book, so the author may have written a new intro for later editions. But in this, I have, the path of the personal calling is no easier than any other path, except that our whole heart is in this journey. We who fight for our dreams suffer far more when it doesn't work out, because we cannot fall back on the old excuse, oh, well, I didn't really want it anyway. And that was a little bit confronting to me, that whole like idea of being able to shrug something off of like, oh, I guess I didn't really want that. I didn't really want that job. I didn't really want that, I don't know, whatever, fill in the blank, right? That's kind of the excuse we use to allow ourselves to give up on something that at one point we were really drawn to.
Yeah, no, I love that. And to go along with that, one of the notes I made to myself of a quote that stuck out early on and I read the 25th anniversary edition. It's the possibility of having a dream come true that makes life interesting. So that kind of dovetails off of what you were just talking about in terms of this idea of following the heart. But then there's also that sense of resistance. And I love this idea about, making life interesting, because the journey that the character goes on in The Alchemist, definitely, I mean, there's no doubt, like, it's an interesting path. And one of the things that is really relatable is that it takes time. I think one of the dangers or, things in our current culture, especially with social media and quick access to information, is that we think, and especially as writers, that, oh, like you said, Elizabeth, that you did a 30-day challenge, like, oh, I have to write something in 30 days. Or you see promotional things for write your book in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever it might be. And while there might be people doing that, the reality of the writing journey is that to really do it to the level that you want to be happy about what you're putting out there, it needs to take time. And I really appreciated that in The Alchemist, that, yes, this young boy is given this omen about where he's supposed to go, but it's not like he gets there right away. I mean, a year passes or longer. And so so that's a fascinating part of the book. And I think that it's something to hold on to, especially as writers, because I think there can often be the frustration of, oh, I'm not getting enough done. I'm not where I want to be. But truly what The Alchemist shows us is that just staying the course and to take the next step forward helps you get there.
So I've been reading Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert while simultaneously reading The Alchemist for the purposes of this podcast and this month's book club. And so this accompanies The Alchemist so well and makes it specific for the writer. And just in regards to what you were just bringing up, Stephanie, about it taking time, like Elizabeth Gilbert had a number of traditionally published books out before she made it big with Eat, Pray, Love. And she didn't know that it was going to be, what it was. She literally just put her heart on the page, and she talks about how she just showed up authentically and she wasn't sure how people were going to take it. And much to her surprise, they really just resonated with it. And some people absolutely hated it, but there were a large number of people, like several million, I think 6.5 million copies sold, something like that, who absolutely loved it. And so, yeah, I loved so many of the like understirring lessons of The Alchemist when it came to time, about how Santiago gets really waylaid in the crystal shop and how he experiences that theft when he first comes to town. Like, I could see it coming because I've also felt like I've experienced those things that have, very quickly felt like a derailing, but were ultimately to go down a different path. To writing was I had a totally different format of my book early on. I've spoken about this, kind of a memoir self-help combo. I got feedback, almost a totally different book at this point, and so what felt like a total derailing, even the way that my divorce really emphasized or shifted the way that I wanted to approach certain stories in my book, in my memoir, those things on the surface seemed like really big setbacks, just like the theft of all of his money. But ultimately, it's helped me point me down the right path.
Well, and it's interesting thinking about the theft that Santiago experiences, because it's at a time where he sees a beautiful sword and there's a distraction, and in the world of both entrepreneurship and creativity, there's sort of that shiny object syndrome that happens where you think something over here is going to be better for you, that it's going to make you happier or do something more for you. And it's interesting because I think when I think about my own writing journey, and I've done a lot of writing throughout my life, but this shift to a more creative focus, sometimes I doubt it, in sort of the same way that the crystal merchant is like, well, maybe I should go, just stick with what's comfortable. And even Santiago goes through that a few times of, well, maybe I should go back to buying my sheep again and going back to being a shepherd. And it's interesting, in the course of his journey, it's sort of a cautionary tale about not letting yourself fall back on what feels comfortable. And it's going through what's uncomfortable that brings you to where you are meant to be. And especially, I think about it for us, like even with the podcast, like this was very uncomfortable for me, especially in the beginning, because the thought of putting myself on video for YouTube, but then also just being on audio for people to listen to, and thinking, well, who's really going to want to listen to what I have to say? And it feels the same way as a writer, like who's going to want to read what I have to write? But ultimately, you will find your readers, and you can't please everyone. That's obvious, because even if you go to the most popular authors and look at the 1-star reviews, like the popular authors out there have the 1-star reviews, and if it was possibly to be in the negatives, there'd probably be some people who would go deeper, in that direction. So, it's just interesting to think. And, and when I have days where I think like, oh, I just don't have an idea, I have to be gentle with myself and say, okay, maybe now's not the time to be trying to work on this. Or, how can you, pick up where you left off? And that's often the place where I go to, is I go back to my writing I open it up, I look at where I left off, and I just allow myself to just get back with my characters and let it flow.
Yeah, I definitely have felt stuck at various points because I was really good at something. That could be a way I would explain my entire forensic science career. And trying to, vary the iterations of it to make me happy, but ultimately it was just something I was really good at that I didn't enjoy. One of the things that the old king tells the boy early on is he tells him about beginner's luck. In what ways do you feel like you've experienced beginner's luck, either in your writing or other similar endeavors?
Well, I mean, in terms of, other endeavors, certainly like in my teaching career, it was always easy for me to find a job. And so that kind of kept me in the flow of staying in that career path because it was like, oh, this is easy. This is just happening for me. But again, I wasn't really enjoying it. When it comes to my writing, I know like when I did my master's, I got my master's thesis published. So that very much felt like beginner's luck because I wasn't really planning to have it published. But then, my advisor was like, oh, hey, there's an international journal. Let's just submit it and see. And then all of a sudden, there I was published, and then, very much the same with, some other little writing things and, the book I wrote for my previous business and just, putting out that out there and, getting a lot of positive feedback. And so, I think that there've been those times, but for me, it was often that within like my family narrative, I wasn't always thought of as the one who's going to be the writer. And so I had that often in the back of my head of, well, maybe this isn't what I'm meant to be doing. And so that's where I could relate this Santiago in The Alchemist when he would have moments of, well, maybe this isn't the path I'm meant to be on because I'm encountering obstacles. And really for me, it was messaging that were the obstacles for the writing because when I start to put myself out there, I get a lot of, good feedback and encouragement. And, in our newsletter this week, we talked about that, about, being willing to put yourself out there and take the risk. And that's definitely something that comes through in The Alchemist with the journey of, continuing to he continues to talk to people and interact in different ways that keep pushing him towards his destination of the pyramids and ultimately, discovering himself in the process. And I think that that's important to remember. And again, like going back to what we were talking about before about taking time with it, that it does take time. And that's what I have to remind myself because oftentimes, I want to have something happen right away. And especially when something has come really easily, that sometimes that's not always a good thing. That sometimes it's more, what you work towards and have to have some struggle with that actually feels better. And so sometimes, even though I've had a fair share of beginner's luck, at the same time, there's that feeling inside me where it's like, well, yeah, but that almost felt like it just was too easy. And the rewards don't feel as great as when I've had other times where I've really had to struggle to find my way to where I am.
Yeah, definitely. For me, I guess the most obvious example of beginner's luck that I've encountered with writing is that I had submitted one of my stories to one online literary magazine and it got accepted for publication back in February. So, that was my first attempt at putting stuff out there. I was really nervous about it, so much so that I only put one thing out there and then just held my breath for the rejection. And the rejection didn't come. But so just like you were emphasizing, Stephanie, I almost kind of knew it was beginner's luck. And now I'm like, okay, but what if I do another one? Like, is that one going to go well or was that just beginner's luck? And, But it was very encouraging to have someone kind of recognize my work at that point, and also to be able to share my writing in that way with family and friends and those others who are supporting my writing experience and writing journey, to get a sense of what my writing style is like, what my writing voice is like. So definitely lots of lessons learned from it along the way, but that's my best example of beginner's luck when it comes to my writing. I think it's also interesting to look at the way the book presents a couple of the core fears that people have. The Crystal Merchant is such a good example of someone who has the fear of success. You see over and over again how that character holds himself back from pursuing what he attests is his biggest dream of taking the pilgrimage to Mecca. And also, he questions the boy anytime he gives him a business idea that would allow him to expand his crystal shop, right? So whether it was, polishing them or selling different things or serving tea or, a number of different like ventures and expansions, direction, is that really going to get me towards my goal? If his goal truly was to pursue the pilgrimage, maybe he doesn't want a giant tea shop, crystal shop he has to leave behind. But he wasn't going to pursue the pilgrimage either. And he talks about how, but I'm afraid that it would all be a disappointment, so I prefer to just dream about it. That's what he says in regards to why he's not going to pursue his dream. I'm afraid that if my dream is realized, I'll have no reason to go on living. Not so much that, I'll create a new dream, but oh my gosh, I only have this one dream, and if I ever achieve it, then what's my life purpose after that?
Well, there's definitely fear there with the Crystal Merchant with that. And I think it's a common one when you have a dream that you're wanting to follow and you think that you're going to get, a lot of opinions from others that are going to get in the way and not let you get there. And, I think that one of the things that we see too often is people talk about regrets when they're older, because they didn't follow, their dream essentially. And that, too often we find ourselves in places where it's, and in the case of the Crystal Merchant, well, but I have to do these things, or I can't do these other things because it'll mean too much change. And one of the quotes that stood out for me, especially about resisting this idea of change and actually following your dream, is he says, I don't want to change anything because I don't know how to deal with change. I'm used to the way I am. And so this whole idea of just being content with where he is, yet at the same time, he's not content. And so, we have this risk, especially as writers. I mean, I know when I have days when I don't get enough writing done, I'm kind of in a sour mood. It's like my brain is holding on to all my thoughts and ideas, but once I get them out, then it's like, oh, I feel better. Okay, now I'm doing, what I'm meant to be doing. And I think that change can be scary, and we all resist it in different ways. But as we've noticed with what we're doing is, we both made changes, and then the path has become clearer. And, while it sounds kind of woo-woo, there just really is this sense that things start to open up and you gain more clarity as you keep moving forward towards whatever it is that you're dreaming of doing, whether it's publishing a book, publishing short stories, poetry, whatever it might be.
Well, and that brings me to the next point about like the focus on the future, which is where all that fear stuff resides, the fear of failure, the fear of success, and this passage about staying present. The secret is here in the present. If you pay attention to the present, you can improve upon it. And if you improve on the present, what comes later will also be better. Forget about the future and live each day according to the teachings. God only rarely reveals the future. When he does so, it is for only one reason. It's a future that was written so as to be altered, meaning that you're meant to change that future, to rewrite that future. And I thought that piggybacked really well with what you were just saying, Stephanie, about just being really present in the moment and not worrying about how the writing today is going to impact your writing tomorrow or next month or when your book's going to be done, but it's just about getting those words on the page today, right? And it's just about meeting yourself where you're at today. And if that is to take, a side road that feels like a curvy, dark path, unfamiliar territory, into poetry or a short story or something not related to your primary project, you have to know that that's still serving a purpose. You're still gaining experience and, practice, and I mean, maybe even just allowing some of that creative energy to flow and the mental barriers to break down a little bit.
Well, and I love that whole quote about being in the present, because I think too often we're either keeping ourselves stuck in the past too much, or we're trying to think of how we can have everything figured out ahead of us. And I think it's such a good reminder about being right where you are. And it's not that you can't think about the past and the future, because certainly, I mean, in both of our cases with our writing, both of us with our writing have talked about using aspects of our life from the past, of course, influence our ideas for where we're going and, what we're thinking about with our own writing. And one of the things that I was looking back at my notes here was going back a little bit to our discussion about fears, where there's a quote from the book about this relationship between fear and following your heart. So there's some people who say that you can't have fear and love at the same time. You can't have, you have to have one or the other. And the quote is, "Don't give in to your fears. If you do, you won't be able to talk to your heart." And I think that also is very true about staying in the present, about taking stock of where you are. Are you experiencing a fear or, self-doubt? And it's so common. I mean, writers, I think across the board, all have some aspect of imposter syndrome, like, who am I to write this book? Who am I to publish? Like, nobody's going to discover me. Nobody's going to like what I write. And it's really not true. But, we tell ourselves all kinds of stories, and that's that fear coming up. But if we take a moment and we listen to our heart and what brings us a sense of joy and love and purpose, that's going to open up more pathways for us. And I mean, there's always going to be fear, and there's always going to be, it playing with, your love for wanting to do something. And it really comes down to, what's your choice? And that was the same thing with Santiago on his journey, where that even though he had moments of fear and not being sure about going ahead, he was following his intuition and kept going back to, what the king had said to him early on of when you want something, all the universe conspires to help you achieve it. And in different ways, that same line is repeated multiple times throughout the book. And of course, that repetition is very effective in reminding us to come back again to, when you really want something, the universe will help you achieve it.
I think that quote you shared about the fear and the blocking of the heart too, like from a practical sense, that's where I know I personally, but I've also heard this recommended as a practice. That's where I benefit from journaling before I sit down to work on my actual manuscript. If I'm feeling any sort of doubt or fears, to go ahead and get those out in my journal. so that I do have access to tap into the heart in order to work on my manuscript.
Well, and in an upcoming episode with one of our guests, I believe it's going to be released next week. There's a discussion about the power of doing journaling to, help you engage more actively with your writing. And I think that that's a great recommendation, and I find that that helps me as well. And certainly, any of you listening who are familiar with Julia Cameron's work and The Artist's Way, I mean, she has that as a core component of her approach with morning pages, which she encourages you to do it like the minute you get up in the morning. I'm not, so diligent about doing it the minute I get up in the morning, but it is very helpful for just, you know, essentially clearing out the cobwebs or whatever junk might be weighing on your mind. And again, that's another way, as we were just discussing, about keeping yourself in the present is when you just can journal everything out. It can just like get rid of whatever might be blocking that creative flow and get it down on the paper.
One of the last points I have, and feel free to add anything after this, Stephanie, is this concept of learning through action or recognizing that it's all about the journey or the process. So this is a quote from the book. There's only one way to learn, the alchemist answered. It's through action. Everything you need to know, you have learned through your journey. And then a couple pages later, it says, when I have been truly searching for my treasure, every day has been luminous, because I've known that every hour was a part of the dream that I would find it. When I have been truly searching for my treasure, I've discovered things along the way that I never would have seen had I not had the courage to try things that seemed impossible for a shepherd to achieve. I think that's just a great reminder that even those days where we don't feel like we're producing anything that's going to end up in the final version of, say, a book or whatever, that it's all a part of the process. We're being exposed to different ideas, different thoughts, playing with different things, whether that's, at a writer's workshop or through podcasts we listen to or guests we get to talk to and interview with. We're picking up all sorts of vital information, little nuggets of wisdom at a time that is slowly finding its way to embed itself into our work. It's a little bit like rolling in glitter, right? It's like, even when you're not in that moment anymore, that glitter's going to find its way, into the various, cracks and crevices. And so all of those things that you're experiencing are going to bring, value and variation and insight to your work.
I love that image of rolling in glitter. I think that that's going to definitely stick with me when I think about it. But it also is that whole idea. I love that about, taking action and trying new things. And it can be really scary, but it can be so worth it. And one of the things that really stuck out for me was a quote that says, I only invoke what you already knew. And it's what the alchemist says to Santiago about the journey. And for me, a lot of reading this book actually brought me back to thinking about The Wizard of Oz, which actually was a movie that terrified me when I was growing up. But there's the one quote from Glinda the Good Witch that always sticks with me. That's, you had the power all along, my dear. And I think that it's that same idea that, from the moment you're young, we know what our path is, but there's so many messages that we get from the world around us, from others, that often steer us away. And I think one of the powerful aspects of reading a book like The Alchemist, especially as a creative person or an entrepreneur or wherever you are in your journey, is that it's a very simple reminder of staying true to the path where you feel that you're meant to be.
I do want to add a little caveat that capitalist America has stolen the idea of a purpose and translated that to occupation and way that you make your money and job. And I just want to reiterate that that does not have to be the way that it looks. Sure, this book uses the example of an occupation with a shepherd, but the search for his treasure is not about necessarily like a job title. Sure, there's some monetary gain. And we're talking about it in regards to writing, but not necessarily even writing for any sort of substantial, financial outcome. So just keep in mind that, when we're talking about like this purpose or this personal legend, that legacy that you leave behind, what you're here to do, to create, to experience, to just be in, like, it's all of that. It's not simply like, oh, what was I thinking I wanted to be as a child? I need to get back to that and pick that job. It may not be in the form of a career. It may just be that thing that continues to drive you through the day. Maybe while you're at your accounting job, you're dreaming about, whatever it is that you're working towards, and that could be a part of the path. It doesn't mean you're on the wrong, occupational path. So I just wanted to throw that out there because of the way that messaging has been really hijacked of make your passion the sole source of your livelihood. That may not necessarily be the right move.
So, listeners, thank you for joining us today for our book club discussion of The Alchemist. We hope that if you haven't read it, that you are able to get yourself a copy and pick it up. And we'd love to hear from you. If you do, if you've already read it, we'd love to hear your thoughts and connect with you. So follow the links in the description for this episode and join our newsletter if you haven't already done that, so that you make sure that you don't miss out on all the insights and inspiration we have to share with you on your writing journey.